Hello, it's a Sunday evening, August 27th. I'm giving the video about the reading in banks and kind of generally over this week. I'm going to talk a little quickly because I don't think you want to watch me for 35 minutes, although I may add another video during the week. In your reading on banks, the book's a little dated in terms of some of the information. So on your assignment for this week on the folder for the week of August 28th, tomorrow, September 3rd, I've included the Henry Kaiser Foundation with updates on the ethnicity groups in America, or some people call them race. I don't really find either of those terms very useful anymore. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But I've also, I've got a video for you this week, New Faces on Main Street. I like it because it's actually about the upper Midwest, Great Plains, Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, about refugees that are coming to this particular area. And it's a little dated. It's about 18 years old, but it was kind of shot in the middle of the meatpacking plant immigration back in the 80s and 90s. And then it happened to catch some people from Southeast Asia, particularly the Hmong, who are a mountain tribe that helped us during the Vietnam War. And we brought them over to the United States as refugees because the Vietnamese were not, the North Vietnamese, when they conquered all of Vietnam in 1975, they went about punishing the Hmong people. And I want to throw in that the Hmong, H-M-O-N-G, are not Laotians. They live in the country of Laos, which borders Vietnam on the west side of Vietnam, but they are not Laotians. I guess the best example probably is how people see Native Americans versus European Americans. It's probably the closest I can come to that example. So that you're reading, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk very general terms. I'm not going to say, I don't give tests where you have to repeat something in the textbook in order to get the definition right. I'm going to talk about some general things. Assimilation. He talks on page 3 that the American under the English and then under American with the influence of the English, that we were always very determined to assimilate people. You know, in the early history of the United States, obviously the conflicts with Native Americans, people taking this land and stealing it, however you want to call it, wanted to make it theirs, and they wanted to have people like themselves in control of it. I'll talk a little later about cultural awareness, but one of the initial things, and it goes way back, is very tribal. When you take an area, you try to make everybody in it either your ally or you eliminate your enemies, which in those days was basically genocide of one type or another. It was accomplished by accident through disease or through deliberate murder. I don't believe in papering over things. So assimilation is a little bit of what we get from that as the melting pot myth. The term myth means an explanation or a belief of how things are in the world. A myth doesn't mean it's not true, but often people say the word myth means a lie. It actually means an explanation. We were taught in our history classes that America was coming together and it was just, you know, building up to be exceptional. You hear of this now. A lot of things I'm talking about are against the background of what's going on right now in the United States. So I'm not going to try to hide that. I certainly have some strong political opinions, but I'm not really interested in politics. I don't have any faith in it. So So I'm just going to talk what I think is real, and you may have a different opinion, and of course you're entitled to that, but I always believe you need to support your opinion. So let's go on here with the text. The immigration to the United States early on, American immigration policy was always very pro-England. There was no limitation on how many people from England could come here. We did eventually over the years put limitations or make it difficult for too many people from Germany to come here, or Southern Europeans from Italy or Greece, or Eastern Europeans or Russians or Asians or people from India. But we always gave preference to people that were very similar to the English, the Dutch, for instance, or a lot of Dutch in New York. Terms like ethnicity, and we kind of use that term. We talk about, well, what's your ethnic group? And somebody say, well, he's from Southern Italy, or Greek, or so they usually name a nation, but it could be a group within a nation. It could be a group from different. Oh, my Three Stooges. Sorry, that's a short one. But my clock always tells me it's now 8 o'clock. I'm making this video. Hope you enjoy the dude. I kind of enjoy the dude shirt. But the general view of assimilation is to have people that were like you and shared your language. That would mean that when they would come here, they would more easily become part of the melting pot. But we weren't a melting pot. There was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment, discouraged or at least mistreated people from Ireland that were Catholic. Of course, Protestant Irish were given a better situation. So there were all kinds of discrimination going on. People would call it choice. I'd call it discrimination, but the idea was that if you had people come in that were of a different viewpoint and there were too many of them, then the people in control would lose control. You see it in neighborhoods when they change and different groups come in, or different classes of people. Maybe poorer people come in, or maybe wealthier people come in when they take a neighborhood in a large city, and then it becomes all kinds of millennials, or I hate to blame them, millennials. That term comes up all the time. That's another thing we might talk about later. But you have people come in and they have a different perspective. Maybe they're better educated and they have money and they want to make everything into a condo, or they want to make townhouses. And the people that used to live in that neighborhood, who are now kind of poor, they either sell out, take the money and leave, or if they're just renting, they get pressured, they get forced out of the neighborhood. And that causes a lot of conflict. So it's not just a matter of poor people moving into middle-class neighborhoods. It could be reversed. They're different. The key here is differences. People that are different in some way, economically or socially or ethnically, or the way they look or the language they speak, there's a conflict. And America is a very diverse country. So we have a history of trying to get our act together by controlling the people coming in. But over the centuries, now I don't know how much U.S. history you remember. We're taught it over and over. Sometimes we don't remember much of it because we think we already know it because we heard it once. But one of the main concepts here, I want you to look at that Kaiser Foundation link I put in the page here on Blackboard, because you can look and you can see by state, you can tell what different groups are in. It basically does African Americans. They don't necessarily, you have to look further if you want to look up, are refugees settling my city? If you're from Lincoln or Minneapolis, you have a large number of refugees have come in. If you look on that page down below, I actually listed the refugee, or the visa types you can have. There are visas starting with A and going maybe all the way to Z. I didn't look. But there are many different types of visas you can get to come in the United States. Now, of course, visa means you come in documented, you come in, and I mention on here, without documents or undocumented people. I don't use the term illegal person. The word illegal would seem to make their existence illegal. And I don't think that's going to help anything. That's, you know, and I would argue that is not a term that should be used. Usually any type of term, it's just going to really upset people. And you can, some people would say, well, that's not politically correct. No, there are a lot of terms that we can use that are not politically correct. And they can end up in a fist fight over it. So if you're going to be a teacher and you're going to deal with multicultural education and diversity in the community, you want to find some kind of terminology where people will be civil to each other and not get into fistfights or any other type of violence or just general resentment toward each other. I see that as real counterproductive. So you can look at those, and you can look at the visa types, and you can look at the kinds of people, and you can look up Nebraska or Virginia or New York, and you can see the differences. And by state, you can look at the differences too. It's not just immigrants recently coming in. That's just another, that's a little extra stuff on top of the population. And projections. The textbook here on page 6 has kind of an older projection. We don't know what those might be because we don't know about population, large numbers of families. I know in education, many of you would know this, that probably at least half of all children under 5 in the United States are not white. They, and I'm always reluctant with all these terms where we use, especially the term white. White seems to cover everybody from Russians to Greeks to anybody in Europe, or Australia or England, of course, or Canadians. We're looking at skin color, not looking at their citizenship or their educational background, things like that. So that and the term race, very primitive terms, really. They almost meaningless. And you get the situation in people you just call Tiger Woods type people that are Tiger Woods. He's people don't realize he is hit by his mother. He is half Thai from Thailand, and then through his father, he's African American, he's Native American, and Anglo American, European American, however you want to do that. So he's really 4 or 5 races. And you see that in census now. Some information in schools, they'll say, well, how would you classify yourself? I had to do it when I came to work at UNK, and I didn't put anything down. And they called me up later and said, well, how would you classify yourself? And I said, well, it really was optional on there, so I chose not to. Well, yeah, but how would you classify yourself? And I said, but it's optional, right? Yeah, but we kind of have to, you know, we have to answer to our hiring quotas and stuff like that. And I said, okay, I'm white. All right, I'm not going to claim anything else. But you know, we want to know and collect information about this for compliance. But then we know that these terms are pretty worthless. I come from a town in Missouri where we had a lot of Italian immigrants. I don't want to say Italian, but Italian. And they were from northern Italy, not southern Italy. And we were in a coal mining area. And between 1900 and World War I, thereabouts, 1930, many people after World War II, because of poverty in Europe and also maybe the Depression, many people from northern Italy moved to my part of Missouri. And there was actual discrimination and a lot of, I'd heard when I was young, really racist jokes about Italians. And now, of course, 30, 40 years later, when I look at my old high school people I know on Facebook, so many of them are Italian, they're all intermarried. Nobody makes those jokes anymore. They've assimilated, I guess, if you want to call it. But at that time, there were people that were because they were Catholic too, there was so much discrimination against them. And they were brought in also because people had the coal mining business and they wanted immigrants that would work cheaper and knew about coal mining and the people in northern Italy were coal miners, so they came in. And so it was interesting, the same need for labor. Let's get somebody in and we can pay them less and we won't have to pay unions. That was one of the issues at that time. Okay, so as we look through the chapter, it gives some population breakdown of the United States historically. It talks about immigrants coming into the United States. A lot of people came in from Mexico for many years, mainly because the United States went into Mexico. If you know your history, we had the Louisiana Purchase, so I guess we took over from France or Spain or whoever had that at the time. And then that was basically the entire western United States. And the southwestern United States was basically half of the country of Mexico. California, parts of Colorado, of course, Spanish. Utah, Texas, obviously, that was a separate acquisition, if we want to call it that. So the United States expanded, and as it did with Native Americans, it expanded by pushing other people out of the way. Now, they weren't large populations there, but if we're talking technically, they did own the land. It was their country, and it was taken in terms of war, although we bought some things, sometimes under pressure, like the Gadsden Purchase, which you can look at as kind of a footnote, literally at the bottom of Arizona. So America, we have the idea of mainstream Americans, and they have this little page where they have a big circle and different groups in there: Vietnamese, Anglo-Protestants, Mexican-American, Polish, Jewish, that were Americans, but we're also this. So then we get into these Venn diagrams where I'm this, but I'm also this, And then 3 or more races, it talks on the next page. What I like you to do, and what I do when I read a book, I don't try to read it and take notes over every chapter, over every paragraph, but I want to look for the trend. I want to look, where's this going? What's the story that's being told here? And I think, he's giving stories here and talking about how the United States has become more diverse. But as people that are in the business of multicultural education, and I mentioned on here, a lot of people hear the word multicultural, and then then out come the arguments and the anger, and we don't need multicultural. And I'm thinking, we're already that. How many people can say they're pure anything? Who knows? The idea of purity is, and I got to be careful. I don't want to be. The idea of purity is pretty silly. One of the things he does talk about in this chapter, I'm going to skip over a few things because this is always something that I'm really focused on, is that we tend to tell the story of the Pilgrims and the English, and incidentally, other people come in if they're from Europe, like there were Germans in Pennsylvania, and that's all fine and dandy, and there were Germans in Ohio. They don't mention that up until the 1840s or 50s, a lot of the laws in Ohio were written in German. They had it in German and English, but a lot of people were German, and they had meetings and did their business in German. So when you get people talking about, we always spoke English, no, we didn't. They spoke French in Louisiana and probably up in Maine. People spoke German, ethnic groups, and we'll see that as we go through the course. Ethnic groups coming in kept their language, Yiddish, Italian, German. And the only reason some of those languages died out was because especially in the World War I and World War II, there was intense pressure to be an American because we felt our existence was threatened by Germans, the German Central Powers in Europe, which are principally Germans. And then World War II, Asians with the Japanese. And so there was a lot of, the Japanese were incarcerated. American citizens that were Japanese were arrested. All their property was taken away and they were put in camps. People died in those camps. They weren't called concentration camps, but you can imagine if we just start arresting people, saying, well, yeah, you were born here, but because of how you look and your ethnicity, we're going to put you in camps. Had they done that with Germans and Italians, we wouldn't have fought in World War II because there had been too many of us in jail. Interesting. Okay, so we tend to tell history along a certain viewpoint. The term manifest destiny may linger in your mind from a history test. The belief that the United States was going to expand and its destiny was to take over the North American continent. For some people, that included Canada and certainly big chunks of Mexico and even Cuba and even in the South. And Americans of both North and South, despite Civil War, were in favor of that, a lot of them, because they saw, wow, we can expand slavery, or we can expand our industrial need for resources. In other words, manifest destiny was seen as the ultimate destiny of the group in power in the United States. And it happened. A lot of them were European descent. Some of them were anti-slave, some of them were pro-slave, but they wanted more. I almost think civilizations and peoples are like children, you know. Candy? Yeah, I'll have more. I want some more. No, I've had enough. I don't want any more. You don't usually hear that. There's always, how much gold do you want? I want more. People always driving. They want more of something. So one of the interesting things I find with talks about approaches, and he talks about 4, and I'll just throw this in right now. It's in this chapter. It talks about the, I think it was in this chapter. Maybe I'm just getting old and I'm forgetting things. But there are 4 approaches. One of them is the additive, where you add it in. I'm kind of trying to think where I saw that. Oh, yes, page 19. One was where you talk about contributions. And what happens is you have the main group that you're basically, due to historical traditions, we talk about the Pilgrims, okay? We don't seem to talk about them too much after Massachusetts, you know. I remember we'd always talk about them, and then we got to Halloween, and, you know, we kind of witches and things and Salem witch trials, and pretty soon it was Christmas and we were on something else and we forgot about the Pilgrims. Pilgrims didn't celebrate Christmas, by the way. I'm pretty sure about that. It was not one of their things. But we have on that page 19, the contributions, the additive, the transformative, and the social action approach. Now, this is the big picture in Banks. Contributions approach, and there's actually a book it's called Beyond Heroes and Holidays. And that is when we just pick out certain elements and we talk about Native Americans within the context of the Pilgrims. And it was kind of happy, you know, they had a picnic there or something, you know, you always kind of, Native Americans sat down, they were all friends and stuff. And then, you know, people don't talk about that held for a while. And then, even though I'm sure there was all kinds of things, there was disease spread from the Pilgrims to the Native Americans didn't have immunity, and that was just unintentional, but that's the risk when you contact people from other places. They may bring something that kills you by coughing on you. The contributions approach is talking about, well, the Native Americans taught them how to fish or taught them how to, you know, hunt or something like that. And then you didn't really mention them too much within that context. that's where Native Americans are left out, because unless there is a major conflict, either they're helping or generally they're being killed and there's a war like in Western, the so-called Indian wars, they don't really they seem to disappear. You know, there's a little bit about Tecumseh and the Iroquois in upper New York fighting with the British and so on. But we tend to forget about them because we're more focused on the British. That was our 1812 Civil Revolutionary War. And then we have the additive approach. And what is that? Well, we tend to layer things on. We still have our basic principle of we're promoting traditional American history. I also would say that history would, because of the nature of the country being very heavily Protestant and anti-Catholic, they definitely did not include the Irish as prominent people. Catholics in general were isolated. We had the county of the state of Maryland, but the emphasis was on people that generally were Episcopalian, Church of England, Anglican, a lot of early presidents. There weren't any early Catholic presidents. It just wasn't going to happen. They were Catholics, but they were pretty isolated. They were not going to be in main power. The additive approach on 2 is the curriculum stays about the same. We don't change the pattern of it. We're not going to make people uncomfortable and tell any negative stories about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. You might remember the people discovered that Jefferson had children by Sally, and I can't think of her last name, but by a woman that he had children by. She was a slave, or she might have been freed at some point, but there was a lot of resistance. Well, we don't want to acknowledge that because there was this viewpoint of our founding fathers being English and being very enlightened men, and there was a very underlying, a very racist element of we're not going to acknowledge that African Americans and whites had relationships, and we know a lot of those were not consensual, and we can get into that too. But I don't right at this point. I want to explode. So there's a lot of nastiness and negative and evil and everything else in the history of our country. So we got the contributions approach, the additive approach. We tend to decorate it up. We put a flourish in. The Germans did this, and they founded the Hershey chocolate factory, and the Dutch helped found Wall Street, and things like that. And we'll praise things about the Dutch. I remember they'd always talk about, you had a Dutch uncle or something. And the Dutch were thought of very positively. They brought us tulips. And so you had those little flourishes. I call it decorating. It's like we want to have something more than just plain English. Well, obviously with the English, their food wasn't that exciting. You never go places and say, I want to go to an English restaurant. No, you have Greek, Italian, you have Indian restaurants, you have Chinese restaurants, you have, Mexican restaurants, and some of them are genuine deal. They're not some mass fast food place. But what's interesting is you don't really change, the impetus of history. A lot of people don't interpret history and give the Irish much credit. The Irish were from Europe, but they were the enemies of the English. They were looked down upon, discriminated against, and also because of their religion. They were brought over in horrible conditions. They were lived in if you've ever seen the movie The Gangs in New York, they lived in terrible situations in criminal areas in New York. So they had a very negative, and there was strong discrimination against them. And they were always portrayed as people, negative stereotypes. And we'll talk about stereotypes. But stereotypes are used to keep people down. no, it's not comedy. It's destruction. It's the Irish. They were just good to be brute workers. They were alcoholics, or they were not attractive people. They were not honest people. All kinds of terrible things are said about the Irish to keep them down. And it really was until the 1920s, the first Roman Catholic ran for president, Al Smith in New York in 1928, and he had no chance. People said, oh, he's Catholic, we're not going to vote for him. Southerners weren't going to vote for a Catholic. And a lot of people, Protestants, they weren't going to vote for one because they thought, oh my gosh, their religion will take over our country. We'll lose our freedom. And you could trace that all the way back to the English fear of the Spanish Armada in 1588. So I'm jumping around a little bit, but I wanted to show that it's not a nice, clean, neat progression. The English gave their wonderful ideas from John Locke. Our founding fathers wrote this into the Constitution. We created a just country, and everything was fine until we had the Civil War because we had legalized slavery, or we had somehow not happened to notice it. Incongruity there, okay? That's a thing that still lasts. We know that legacy has not died. Transformative approach and the social action. Now, what is happening there? Well, the social action is something some people would object to. It's saying that we're not just teaching the history, we're not just trying to be nice to each other and bring ourselves together, but we're trying to make ourselves uncomfortable or make other people uncomfortable and realize that things are not the way that history told us it would be or the way we were told by our parents. And believe me, when you go that route, people are upset. You see examples of it now. People are they're wanting to take down Confederate statues. Now we're finding out that a lot of those statues weren't put up right after the Civil War. Robert E. Lee didn't say, yeah, I would like a statue honoring me. These were put up during the time of after Reconstruction, when Jim Crow laws were created in the South, and also in the North. There's a lot of discrimination in the North. So we find you have to, when you deal with multicultural education, you're not just dealing with the here and now. It's like pulling the thread up and realizing, oh my gosh, I'm undoing the sweater of American history. Something is not going to be like I thought it was. Grandma's not going to like this sweater untangled up like that, because the thread that you're pulling on is detecting something that, nobody wanted to talk about. I'm from a town called Macon, Missouri. In the year 1896, an African-American man was accused of assaulting some children. He was almost certainly innocent of that. But people were upset, and they decided to blame him, of all people. I've read the account. He was arrested, but he was never tried. Several ministers tried to stop the lynch crowd, and a number of people, townspeople who have relatives in Macon now. Nobody wants to talk about it. When you bring it up and start, oh, I don't know, that was a long time ago. Now, what's interesting is that when I was a kid, I had this elderly substitute teacher. I remember going trick-or-treating to her house, and she had a problem speaking. And it wasn't because of old age. It was because somebody had attacked her and choked her in 1896. The man that was falsely accused of that and executed almost certainly had nothing to do with it. He was never tried. He was just murdered. And she was one of the victims of that alleged attack by whoever did it. We know somebody did it. And I remember, and I was shocked when I realized, when someone told me, they said, that old lady that lived in that street and taught in school, Macon, she was the one that was attacked, she and her sister. And I don't know the nature of the attack. Sounded like it could have been molestation, but it could have been just attempted theft. I don't know what happened. But this man was accused, and because it was an African-American man and white children, he had no chance. It's related in the story that he was being taken to the railroad bridge where they were going to hang him, and they said, do you want us to drop you to snap your neck, or do you want us to just tie you and lower you down and let you strangle slowly? And you know what he said? He said, it doesn't matter to me. I'm innocent. I didn't do this. And the sheriff and several ministers saw this happen, tried to stop it. They were thrown aside, and the man was hung and left on that bridge until the railroad company threatened to sue the town that if they didn't move the body, that the railroad wasn't going to run, or they were going to sue the town. And they took his body down, and they buried him in an unmarked grave. And I've thought about that man. It's 121 years ago. And there were some rumors that there is a place where they think he was buried, because they said the people put plants there over a long time, and you know that they're not the plants that would normally grow there. Of course, that spot may be gone. His body may not be recoverable. But I think about how people didn't want to talk about that, because that was a long time ago, and it was unfortunate. But it's history, and it was wrong, and it's racism, and it was evil. And people right now could probably, if you knew the facts, could say, your great-grandfather murdered that guy. He was a leader. And people don't want anything to do with that, because they don't want to be blamed for it, but they also don't want to take any responsibility for it. I often thought, what if I went back and said, let's get a fund so we can, at least if we don't have a body, that we're going to acknowledge that this happened and have a service over it. People would be upset. So we don't want to bring that up. It's terrible. I said, yeah. It's like people wouldn't want to, if it hadn't been advertised, if it hadn't been forced to be acknowledged, the Holocaust. There are people in the world now that try to deny the Holocaust. Reasonable people have no problem denouncing that. So when I say multicultural ed, I'm not Mr. Nice Guy. Oh, yeah, well, you have your opinion, and maybe that's totally untrue, but that's okay. I don't feel that way. So we could have conflicts in this course. I'm not here to just tell you, oh, yeah, we're just going to go through this and we'll all feel very nice about it. I'm going to warn you, though, that when you go through that transformative approach and you start making changes and you start challenging some things, people won't like it. They just won't like it. I remember a school I taught at, they were doing some of you may know this, but they were doing the Oregon Trail, and they had a painting of it on a wall. And one of the people that was there at that time, a principal, said, you don't have any women up there. And the person said, well, why is it all women's liber stuff? Or why do women, we have a woman riding in the wagon train. And this particular one was Mormon women pushing carts, because people don't, talk about this that much, that people that were on their way to Utah are often murdered or threatened, discriminated against by some of the good pioneers that were also making their way. And so the Mormons went on the north side of the Platte River going across Nebraska. And so I think the artist, they put a woman in a bonnet pushing a cart. And that's really, and when I say cart, I don't mean a shopping cart. I mean kind of a rough-looking cart. You can imagine, I can't even imagine pushing a cart with no road. I don't know how that happens. But people did it. But I remember some of the guys being very upset about it. Oh, they got that damn cart on there. And I thought, well, that's part of history, right? But they didn't want to acknowledge it, we have all, and I call them myths because the explanation, but they're not. Some of them are myths that are not true. People show programs about the wagon trains, and I remember in the old days, the wagon trains, you know, they were always fighting their way through, and there's a bunch of basically white guys on the wagon train. They were building the wagon. I'm sorry, railroad. I get mixed with the rails, and it's the railroad, and they have all the people working on the railroad, and they're mainly white guys, and they're cowboys, and some of them are hunting buffalo meat, and some of them are doing this. And I said, you know who built the railroads? Minorities built railroads. A lot of Chinese workers built the railroads. They were imported from China to do the dirty work because it's horrible work. And a lot of guys weren't going to do that. African Americans might have done the work. Hispanics would have done the work. You know, it's like people that were cowboys, the cowboys were not all John Wayne types. A total fabrication. But people don't want to see that. They don't want that. I'll show you. I've got evidence right here. It's called the Black Cowboys. And this is what I'll teach you about in this course. This is facts. This is who wanted to go out and live with a bunch of cattle and a few men all by yourselves out in the plains for a few bucks a week or maybe a month, and it was the hardest life you could imagine. Dangerous. You know, try sleeping in a saddle. See how romantic that is. Try getting a bunch of cattle to do the right thing. I think they should have just herded cats myself. But yeah, there were white. It's not arguing that there weren't white people. That were part of it. I'm not saying they weren't there. I'm just saying the portrayal in the media is so untrue. Okay? That's about all I got to say right now. When you look at the new faces on Main Street, I want you to take careful notice of, and I'll talk more about it in the Blackboard, but I'll probably do another podcast on it. I'm sorry, I probably talked too long. If this thing gets too long, you can curse me, okay? Thank you. I'm going to end it right now.